my apologies for the abrupt ending of the part 3 video covering Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. I'm going to pick up where I left off, which was talking about the phallic character and the process by which girls and boys in the Freudian model develop what Freud felt was appropriately sex-connected, senses of gender identity. So boy children were to develop a masculine identity, girl children a feminine identity. And how did they do that? For boys, they start out attached to mom. Eventually, they have to reject mom and move in the direction of connecting to their father as an idealization target, an ego ideal. So for the boy, he becomes initially sexually attracted to mom, but that's seen as socially inappropriate, obviously. So he has to then reject mom and identify with dad to move in a more appropriate direction. For girls, it's a bit more complicated than that. Girls start out similarly attached to their mother and connected to their mom, but once they discover that males have penises and they do not, they start to identify the male as the powerful, the strong, the complete, the ideal, and want to possess him. So in the Freudian idea, the way for girls to eventually achieve an appropriate feminine gender identity, they have to start to see their mother as incomplete. So they go from there to looking to their father as the complete ideal. They have to go through this process of seeing their option. If they want to possess male power, they have to possess their father. And from the Freudian point of view, the impulses of the id are saying you have to possess him sexually. So, you get these really awful images in your mind of a seductive girl child who is pursuing their father. If you think about that stereotype of the daddy's little girl, Freud kind of took that to the nth degree to say that she had these fantasies of sexually possessing her father. But, again, just like with boys, the social rules say absolutely not. Fathers are encouraged to stop holding their daughters, to stop touching their daughters, to discourage that kind of connection. So girls who have already rejected their mothers as inferior, they're in this catch-22 spot where their fathers are rejecting them, but they want to possess the male power they have to give up. So the pathway to appropriate gender identity development for girls is to surrender, essentially. So they have to say, okay, fine, I'll do the best I can, and the best I can is to be like my mother. So the girl returns to the mother as an ego ideal, accepts her fate, and becomes feminine, adopts feminine traits. So the traits associated with the phallic character, things like vanity and self-hatred, humility, bashfulness, chastity, become associated with femininity in the Freudian model. A different version of vanity, more on the side of narcissism, pride, brashness, and promiscuity associated with the masculine. The primary defense at the phallic stage is repression. So repression is pushing ideas out of awareness. So in the person, if there is an adult who is fixated at the phallic level, then they would be, let's say you had a man who was phallically fixated, he may only find attractive women who represent, who look like, who seem like, maybe they're older than him, women who represent his mother. But they would repress the fact of that and replace it with some other information so that they're distant from that anxiety. For girls who are fixated phallic when they're adults, they may be attracted to older men. They may be attracted to men who represent her father. And she may have fairly, in Freud's opinion, predatory desires to possess and control men. for the male who's fixated phallic, they seek a mother object to have a sexual relationship with and subjugate themselves to that female. After the phallic period in childhood, children essentially, they're entering school. So Freud felt that most children went through this modified attachment to their parents somewhere after 5 years of age, when they kind of settle on their primary gender identity as being appropriately connected to their biological sex. So male children become masculine in their gender identity, and female children become feminine in their feminine gender identity. Then they go to school. And for Freud, he believed that they just simply switch off all of those issues and push them into latency, where they're focused on having fun with their friends and going to school and doing sports and learning stuff, gaining skills. This was a time when he believed that if there were unresolved issues from the phallic stage, they were largely repressed. They were pushed to the side by a superego that was emerging and becoming more powerful and capable. He felt that part of the purpose of schooling was to strengthen this superego with information coming from the larger cultural context. After the latency period is when individuals were seen as developing a more fully, frankly, adult sexual identity. So the genital stage of development is when Freud believed that, your school's over. You learned everything you need to learn. Now, after puberty, after, the onset of, for that time period, puberty was not that far away from when adulthood was seen as what you have. So after puberty, when someone is emerging into adulthood, you have the libidinal energy. So you've got a solid superego built. You still have the energy coming from the id. The ego, though, has this kind of arsenal of defense mechanisms, hopefully, ones that are more, that are less distorting of reality. So now the libidinal energy goes more frankly in a sexual direction, where people are pursuing intimate interactions, they're pursuing relationships where they can be fully sexual people. So yet when you go back to that phallic period, boys and girls learn that they have different genitalia. They forge a gender identity of masculinity, femininity. But now, when they're moving into that genital stage post-puberty, now they're trying to fashion, what is my sexual identity? Now, at the Freudian time period, we're not talking about LGBTQ. We're talking about you're either heterosexual or you're not. And one of them, for Freud, is clearly healthy. The other is not. So for Freud, boys and girls have separate pathways to sexual identity. Boys move in the direction of being sexually attracted to females. Girls move in the direction of being sexually attracted to males. So for Freud, he was very clear. He felt that heterosexuality was the norm. Homosexuality, bisexuality were not healthy in his impression of them. So he felt that, at the genital stage, the healthy pathway meant the sexual identity was aligned with the person's biological sex, and the sexual behavior in its healthiest form was heterosexual. Basically, Freud believed that homosexuality and bisexuality came from primarily fixations at the phallic stage, but they could be an outgrowth of earlier fixations as well. The genital character, Freud is a bit vague in terms of the way he describes the traits of people at the genital level. He argued that the primary defense, which was a healthy defense, so the ego is at its healthiest when it does this defense called sublimation, which is basically, I'm going to satisfy my id desires in a healthy way. I'm going to do it in a socially acceptable way. I'm going to, if I have aggressive impulses, I'm going to turn it into being competitive in business or sport. If I have sexual impulses, I'm going to put that in the context of an appropriately socially approved relationship that I have. So you're channeling those id impulses, those animal impulses, into socially approved of avenues. The traits that Freud ascribed to the genital character, again, they're kind of vague. He talked about people as being fully potent, so feeling themselves to be powerful, feeling themselves to be capable. And the areas, he described health as being a human being who's capable of love and work, who's well adjusted. He did define adult sexuality in terms of heterosexuality. He kind of opened the door a little late in his career to be a little more open to the possibility of homosexuality being a healthy pattern, but he really never really backtracked from his idea that heterosexuality was quote-unquote normal. He felt that people were at their healthiest when they were able to be independent first and then share their lives with others. So that's what he means by love without dependency. And, people were happy with themselves. So their egos were strong, that they were happy with themselves, happy with their ability to work and to love. Now, as you've already seen, Freud's opinions about women were not unusual for his time, and that's not an excuse for him. Freud, as you can see in this picture, he had a very close relationship with his daughter Anna. He also had a collaboration with her. She became a psychoanalyst herself. She wrote her own theoretical ideas, some of which are a precursor to modern ideas of child psychology and child psychiatry. And she articulated, as your authors in your text note, elaborations on the Freudian idea of ego defense. At the same time, though, Freud's description of psychosexual development, he clearly positions females as inferior. He argued that, women's development as girl children is really characterized by the fact that they envy men's power, and men's power is associated with the fact that they are male, that they have a male physicality. And women, he argued, perseverate on that they wish they had what men have. And, in his discourse about this, he kind of has this biologically determined idea that it is about the organ, it's about the physical, it's about the biological. You could just as easily make the argument that, women may envy the power that men have that they didn't earn, and wish that they had an equal playing field with them. That doesn't mean they necessarily want to be physically male. Freud often enjoyed saying incendiary things, but there's nothing to indicate he didn't actually believe that this biological idea of penis envy didn't have power. To put this into perspective, let me describe a research study for you, where some researchers, developmentalists who were interested in gender identity, asked preschool-age children. And, preschool is a time when kids become aware that there are boys and there are girls, that there are anatomical differences between boys and girls, and they get curious about it. They also start to kind of pick up on and acquire, because their parents have been raising them in a gender-specified world their whole lives, especially in Western culture. The style of dress, the toys, the way people talk to you, are all highly gendered. So in preschool, they asked little girls and little boys, they asked the girls, what would it be like if you woke up tomorrow and you were a boy? And girls talked a lot about what they would be able to do that they couldn't do now. Boys, when they were asked, what would things be like if you woke up tomorrow and you were a girl? Well, number one, they were horrified. They were like, that would be the worst fate ever. That would be horrible. I wouldn't be able to do anything. It would be awful. So in our cultural context, and that was a study done in the United States, we have sent very strong messages to girls and boys that it's better to be a boy in some ways, that the way you can move through the world is more empowered, that it's stronger. Now, those gender messages are shifting. They are changing. However, I want you to remember that while Freud's ideas are often, criticized and sometimes they're just laughable, there is a kernel of truth to them that keeps Freudian ideas alive in popular culture. So like that research study, that he has a point that girls at a very young age become aware that there are ways in which the world is structured that limits them. And for boys, they become aware that in their environment, they may have these power advantages. So, don't dismiss it completely. Clearly, the evidence shows that girls don't want to have a penis. In similar research to the research I just described, when girls are asked, do you want that body? And they're like, no, even at a very young age, that's not what they want. They want the freedom to move in the world in a way that boys can, that they cannot. Boys, when you ask them, about the physical, they're a little more, don't change my physicality. But that a lot of that is tied to the messages they've been sent about their physical qualities. At the same time, boys are aware that there are things that they are supposed to learn to control, to tamp down, like fear and sadness, and that's something that they become aware of pretty early. Now, for Freud, he did believe that women were more jealous, more malevolent, more manipulative, because they have to find ways to compensate for their lack of masculine superiority. He felt that for adult women who were never going to achieve the kind of developmental completion that adult men could, that they have these desires. Penis envy in mature adult women, he believed, was converted into the desire to have a son and to be very covetous of that son. So, he believed that since women didn't have the same kind of Oedipal experience that is motivated by fear, so, women, girls, they're motivated just to surrender. They realize they can't have what they want, so they surrender. Boys decide that they are afraid of the power of another stronger, bigger man. So they are pausing to fight another day when they're stronger. He also assumed that female sexuality was never going to be as mature as male sexuality. So you can see, pretty clearly, woven throughout Freudian theory, it's not so much hatred of women, but a magnification of prevailing attitudes of his time and place in Western Europe. His attitudes about women's mental health, that women were less mature, that they were less well-developed, that they had weaker ego, that was all pretty commonplace belief among people, not just psychoanalysts and not just Freud. So don't think he's cornered the market on sexism here. His ideas were not particularly unusual for the time. What was unusual was the way he talked about these physical attractions between children and their opposite sex parent. His sexualization of children was problematic. One enduring aspect of Freudian thought was the central position of anxiety as a component of people's experience. So, the way that the structures of personality work, the ego's major issue in adulthood, in childhood, the ego's major big deal is, how do I cope with anxiety? Should I deal with it directly? Do I deal with it defensively? Freud believed that dealing with anxiety that's associated with our impulses, anxiety is associated with the id, and the potential for those impulses to be completely unleashed. Dealing with that anxiety directly is not going to work. Think about the mythologies we have, like about werewolf. So if you're a werewolf, the moon comes up and you turn into a monster, right? For Freud, dealing with the anxiety of your internal impulses, your animal impulses, and trying to say, yep, I'm a werewolf and I'm going to embrace it. No. For Freud, he's like, no, you don't want to look at that reality. You don't want to go there. So what do? You distort, you sublimate, you go into denial, you repress, you use defense mechanisms to protect your ego from the reality that if you let your id out, if you let it out, bad things will happen, that you will go evil. And Freud kind of intimated that. He argued that if the id was fully manifest, it would be like you were a permanent werewolf, where you turn into the beast and you stay that way. So, forgive the metaphor, but, Freud used the stories that his patients told him about dreams that they'd had. And many of these dreams involved these transformations into animal, these transformations into monster. And he interpreted that to mean a transformation into the full manifestation of the id's impulses. He argued that there were 3 kinds of anxiety that people typically deal with. There are real reasons for anxiety. There can be real problems that people face in their lives that are objective. So those are real threats. That's natural anxiety that everybody has to cope with. But then there are also neurotic anxieties. And that's the kind that I was just talking about, where anxiety associated with id impulses can make you neurotic. So when you employ defenses that are heavily distorting, things like reaction formations, introjections, projections, when they're heavily distorting, they can cause neurotic anxiety. Moral anxiety comes from superego pressures. So if the superego becomes overpowered, overly moralistic, overly guilt-inducing, that can lead to anxiety associated with failing to live up to the standards of the superego. That can also produce psychological consequences when that anxiety becomes overwhelming. So a little more about the ego defense mechanisms. And, in popular culture, we use the language of defense all the time. I hear words like denial, you're in denial, or stop displacing your anger onto me, or stop projecting. I hear that language a lot, even though people don't always know that it has anything to do with Freud. So ego defense mechanisms are essentially ways that the ego changes reality such that the impulses from the id or the guilt-inducing thoughts from the superego have less ability to cause discomfort, to cause anxiety. So the ultimately, the defense mechanisms make it possible for the ego to negotiate. It makes it possible for the ego to say, we're going to get as much happiness and pleasure out of this situation as we can, but we're going to keep the guilt as low as possible. So we want to get the impulses of the id enough satisfaction that they'll quiet down, but we don't want to simultaneously get the superego all bent out of shape and make us feel guilty. So it allows for partly satisfying the impulses. When do these defense mechanisms come into play? They come into play when we find ourselves in a situation that's conflicted. So, a situation where, let's say you have a married person, and the married person sees a new coworker, and the coworker, they sit back and they look at that coworker and they go, wow, that coworker's super hot. But then they think, oh, wait, I'm married. I'm not supposed to have thoughts like that. And the guilt voice from the superego is like, shame on you, having dirty thoughts about someone who's not your partner. And at the same time, your id's like, dude, my new coworker's hot. So it represents a conflict. What the ego defense mechanism does is say, okay, how do I make me seeing my brand new coworker as really attractive? How do I make that okay? Well, you could say, you could kind of twist it and say, well, I don't know what's up with other people thinking my new coworker's so hot. And you could deny that it's your thought and make it other people's thought. That's a defense. Sublimating it, you can say to yourself, I can admire the beauty of another and remain just as happy with my spouse. Or you can displace it. You can, admire the beauty of and attractiveness of your new coworker and then go home and jump your spouse. And frankly, Freud put it that way. It was like, yeah, here's a conflict. What do I do about it? If I'm a married person and I'm feeling like encouraged to be sexually attracted to someone else, I have to put more energy in having sex with my spouse, right? So what do the defense mechanisms do? They limit our awareness of our baser nature and the possibility that we could disappoint the superego. They vary in terms of how much they distort the true essence of the impulse or instinct that's coming from the id. Think about that. I don't want to know that I have a beast inside me. I'd really rather not know that. And the ego really wants you not to know that because it would hurt your self-esteem. We want to see ourselves as good, decent, smart people. We don't want to see ourselves as a wanton animal that can get out of control. So defenses, they differ in their degree of distortion. They're more distorted if they were created at an earlier point in development. So orally fixated defenses are worse. They're more neurotic in adults than are anally fixated defenses. Phallic defenses are less distorting than anal defenses. The best, least distorting defense is sublimation because you're partially aware. You know exactly what you're doing. If you like being aggressive, pound on a handbag or become a boxer or play football or get super good at business and winning, whatever it is. You sublimate those desires. Now, and I'm going to go through these quickly because there's a lot of them, and you can read about them in your text. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. But many of these will sound familiar because they're terms that we use in everyday speech. We use the word repression, where you have something that's really anxiety-provoking, something that happened, something traumatic. You can push it out of awareness so that you're not thinking about it and it's not threatening you. Denial is an unwillingness to allow into consciousness something that disturbs us. So, just not being willing to acknowledge that it's real. Rationalization is this way of coming up with rational sounding reasons for why we've done things that were inappropriate. I talked about reaction formation already and projection. Regression means embracing behaviors from an earlier, or expressing behaviors from an earlier point in development as a defense. We often talk about the idea that, there's this guy and he's a man-child. He doesn't pick up after himself. He doesn't take care of himself. He does this, he does that, and he acts like a child. That's kind of a regressed person. We've already talked about sublimation. Intellectualization is this way of, by using smart sounding explanations of what you've done, it pushes away or kind of couches in this language of intellectualism the real motivations behind your behavior. And displacement is, a simple redirection of dangerous thoughts, scary thoughts, aggressive thoughts, that are directed towards an object that's inappropriate and putting them onto a safe object. So, if you have this impulse, you'd like to pound in your boss's face. Who hasn't had that thought occasionally? You can't do that, so you come home and you pick a fight with your partner. Or you yell at your kids. And then isolation, I talked about already. So that ends my coverage of Freud. We won't be leaving him entirely, though. When I start on chapter 2, we will be talking about Carl Jung. We won't leave Freud fully behind. We will be talking about him in juxtaposition with pretty much every theorist we talk about from here on.